A lonely widow paid $2 for a giant Apache with a sack on his head at auction. The wind howled through the dusty street as the auctioneer's gavel fell, and the crowd froze. No one knew why she did it. No one knew what was under that sack until she pulled it off. This wasn't a broken prisoner. This was a man with the strength of the mountains and a secret buried deep in the high country. A secret worth killing for. But the railroad's men are coming, and they'll burn, steal, or hang anyone who stands in their way. In the dead of winter, with the barn already in flames and a boy's life in the balance, one question hangs in the frozen air. Will she risk her life to protect him and the truth he carries? Will the land, the water, and their only chance at freedom be lost forever? Your reactions reaffirm something simple yet powerful, that stories still shape us, even in silence. If you believe in the soft endurance of love, truth, and doing what's right, then you're exactly why these stories exist. The January wind cut sharp across Silver Bluff's town square, making the handful of gathered townsfolk huddle deeper into their coats. Clara Whitley stood at the edge of the crowd, her worn leather purse clutched close. The morning sun cast long shadows across the packed snow, but brought little warmth to the proceedings. She'd only come to town for salt and lamp oil, basic necessities to keep her small ranch running through the winter months. The prisoner auction hadn't been part of her plans, yet here she was, watching as Sheriff Matthews and his deputy let out the day's lots, mostly petty thieves and drunks who'd work off their fines through purchased labor. The wooden platform creaked under heavy boots as the auctioneer, red-faced Mr. Billings, called out each prisoner. "Next up, final lot of the day, folks." His voice carried across the square, sharp as the morning air. Special delivery from the territorial prison. Clara's attention shifted as two guards dragged forward a man who towered over them both. A rough burlap sack covered his head, but his bearing remained proud despite the iron shackles at his wrists. His buckskin shirt hung loose on his frame, suggesting weeks of prison rations. "Apache stock," someone whispered nearby. "Dangerous one, they say." The murmurs rippled through the crowd like wind through prairie grass. Clara noticed how the other townspeople took small steps backward, creating distance between themselves and the platform. "Starting bid at $2, Billings called out, his usual enthusiasm notably dimmed. "Strong back, good for heavy work." "Going once, ... Silence fell across the square. Even the most desperate farmers who usually bid on prisoner labor kept their hands down, their eyes averted. $1 then? Billings tried again, mopping his brow despite the cold. Surely someone can use an extra hand for spring planting. Clara couldn't explain what moved her in that moment. Perhaps it was the man's dignity, somehow intact despite his circumstances. Or maybe it was the memory of her late husband, Thomas, saying that every soul deserved a chance at redemption. Whatever the reason, she found herself stepping forward. $2, she said, her voice clear and steady despite her racing heart. The crowd parted like startled cattle, heads turning to stare at the widow Whitley. She felt their eyes on her, but kept her gaze fixed on the auctioneer. $2? Billings blinked in surprise, his gavel hovering uncertainly. "From Mrs. Whitley? Are you certain, ma'am?" Clara reached into her purse and withdrew to silver dollars, holding them up so they caught the winter sunlight. "I am $2 bid," Billings announced. Though there was no need, everyone in the square could hear a pin drop. "Going once, ... going twice, ... He seemed to hold his breath along with the rest of the crowd, waiting for someone to challenge the bid. No one did. "Sold to Mrs. Clara Whitley." The bang of his gavel echoed off the buildings surrounding the square. As Clara made her way forward to complete the transaction, she heard the whispers start up again. "Gone mad. She has ... That Apache kill her in her sleep ... Always was a strange one, since Thomas passed ... Mr. Peterson, the storekeeper, caught her arm as she passed. Mrs. Whitley, Clara, think about what you're doing. You're buying trouble, plain and simple. She gently but firmly removed his hand. I'm buying a man's labor, Mr. Peterson, same as anyone else at these auctions. Now, if you'll excuse me, the guards watched warily as she handed over her coins to the clerk. One of them held out a length of rope attached to the prisoner's bound hands. You'll want to keep him tied, ma'am. These savages can't be trusted. Clara took the rope but said nothing, her lips pressed into a thin line. She gave it a gentle tug, and the tall man followed her down the platform steps. The crowd parted again as she led him across the square, their boots crunching in the snow. She could feel the tension in the rope, sense the man's uncertainty matching her own. What had she done? What had possessed her to spend her precious money on this stranger, this potentially dangerous stranger, when she could barely keep her ranch afloat as it was? Yet with each step away from the auction block, Clara felt more certain. Whatever had guided her hand in this moment, she would see it through. Thomas had always said she had more spine than sense sometimes. Maybe he'd been right. The sound of their footsteps echoed off the false-fronted buildings as they made their way down Silver Bluff's main street. Clara kept her chin up, ignoring the faces that appeared in shop windows to watch them pass. The stranger's breathing was steady behind her. His steps measured, despite his bound hands and the sack still covering his face. Her heart continued to pound against her ribs. But she forced her own breathing to remain calm. She had made her choice. Now she would have to live with it, one way or another. The winter wind picked up again, carrying the promise of more snow. Clara found herself thinking of the long walk back to her ranch, wondering if they would make it before the weather turned. But first things first, she needed that salt and lamp oil she'd come to town for in the first place. Such ordinary errands, on what had turned into anything but an ordinary morning. Clara's hands trembled slightly as she lit the oil lamp in her kitchen. The flame cast dancing shadows across the worn wooden table and rough-hewn walls. Behind her, the tall figure stood motionless, still bound and hooded, waiting. She drew a deep breath, steadying herself. I'm going to remove that sack now, she said, keeping her voice level. I expect you to stay calm, same as you've been. When no response came, she reached up and carefully cut the burlap with her kitchen shears. The rough material fell away, revealing a face that made her pause. The man before her wasn't what the townsfolk's fearful whispers had painted. His dark eyes held a soldier's steady gaze, not a criminal's shifty glare. High cheekbones and a strong jaw framed features that spoke more of dignity than danger. His black hair was longer than military regulation, but neat, tied back with a leather strip. I am called Dakota, he said softly, his voice carrying the faintest accent. You show courage, bringing me to your home. Clara busied herself at the cook stove, trying to hide her surprise at his perfect English. Seemed the Christian thing to do. She stirred the bean and venison stew she'd left simmering that morning. Are you hungry? Yes? He remained standing, his bound hands held carefully in front of him. But first, may I know the name of my ... He paused, choosing his words ... purchaser. Clara Whitley, she said, ladling stew into a bowl. And I didn't purchase you, just your labor. She set the bowl on the table. Sit, eat. He settled onto the bench with fluid grace, despite his bonds. The distinction honors you, Mrs. Whitley. Clara sat across from him, watching as he managed the spoon despite his restricted movement. His manners were impeccable. Another surprise. You want to tell me how you ended up on that auction block? Dakota took his time chewing, swallowing, before he spoke. I was taken after a dispute with the railroad men. They've been pushing their tracks across grazing lands promised to my people in the last treaty. When we protested their men damming our water source, they called it a skirmish and arrested those of us they could catch. Why didn't you speak up at the auction? Tell your side. A faint, bitter smile crossed his face. Men with rifles don't. Listen, they hear only what they expect to hear. Clara nodded slowly, understanding all too well how the territorial authorities operated. She'd seen enough treaty violations during her 12 years on the frontier to know justice often meant different things to different people. "You'll sleep in the barn tonight," she said, rising to clear his empty bowl. "I'll bring out blankets. It's cold, but there's good hay in the loft. Thank you." He stood as she did, that military bearing again. "You need not fear me, Mrs. Whitley. I have no wish to harm one who shows kindness." All the same, Clara threw the heavy iron bolt across the barn door that night after settling Dakota in the loft. She told herself it was just common sense. Any widow living alone would do the same. But as she lay in her narrow bed, listening to the wind rattling the shutters, sleep proved elusive. The first gray light of dawn found her already up, stoking the cook stove and preparing to do her morning chores. She left Dakota locked in the barn while she fed the chickens and milked her 2 cows, taking comfort in the familiar routine. When she finally opened the barn door, she found him already awake, sitting cross-legged on a hay bale. He'd somehow managed to arrange his blankets neatly, despite his bound hands. "Coffee?" she offered, and he nodded gratefully. Back in her kitchen, Clara poured 2 cups of the strong brew. Steam rose in the cool morning air as they sat at her table. Once again, "Your land seems dry," Dakota observed, warming his hands on the cup. "The creek bed I saw yesterday holds little water." Clara's shoulders tensed. Water was every rancher's concern out here, but this winter had been especially hard. "We get by." "There is a spring," he said carefully, watching her face, "sacred to my people. Its waters never fail, even in the driest seasons." Her heart quickened. At his words, her cattle were already showing signs of thirst, and spring was still months away. But before she could press him for details, movement caught her eye through the window. Riders approached in the distance, their shapes dark against the morning sky. As they drew closer, Clara recognized the railroad company's distinctive hat. "Bands, they're asking at every ranch and homestead," Dakota said quietly, following her gaze, "looking for their escaped property." Clara's hands tightened around her coffee cup as she watched the riders draw nearer. The morning sun glinted off rifle barrels slung across their saddles. In just moments, they would reach her front gate. Clara's heart raced as she heard hoofbeats approaching. "Quick," she whispered to Dakota, up to the loft. She gestured toward the barn's wooden ladder. Despite his bound hands, he climbed with surprising agility, disappearing into the shadowy hay storage above. 3 riders pulled up to her gate in a cloud of powdery snow. Their horses' flanks were lathered from hard riding steam rising in the cold morning air. The men wore the distinctive brown felt hats with striped bands that marked them as railroad company men. Clara straightened her apron and walked out to meet them, forcing her face into a pleasant expression. "Morning, gentlemen. What brings you?" "Out in this weather?" The lead rider, a weathered man with a silver-streaked mustache, touched the brim of his hat. "Ma'am, we're looking for an escaped prisoner. Apache fellow. Big one. Might have passed through these parts. An Apache." Clara widened her eyes, channeling the fear she'd seen so often in town women's faces. "Here? Heavens, no. I haven't seen anyone pass by in days." She gestured to her yard. "As you can see, just me and my animals." The second rider, younger and clean-shaven, leaned forward in his saddle. "Mind if we take a look around, ma'am? For your safety, you understand?" "Well, ... Double quotes. Clara hesitated, then brightened. "Would you boys like some coffee first?" fresh pot on the stove. Awful cold morning for riding. The third man started to dismount, but the leader held up his hand. "Kind offer, ma'am, but we've got ground to cover." His eyes narrowed slightly. "You should know anyone found harboring this fugitive will face prison time themselves. Company takes a dim view of folks interfering with justice." Clara wrapped her shawl tighter, letting a shiver show. "Lord preserve us. I'll be sure to bolt my doors extra tight tonight." They rode off, leaving fresh hoof prints in the snow. Clara waited until they were well past her property line before hurrying to the barn. Her legs felt weak with relief. "They're gone," she called softly up to the loft. Dakota's face appeared at the edge. "You play your part well, Mrs. Whitley. Stay up there a spell longer, just to be safe." She fetched him water and some bread and cheese, passing them up carefully. Those men meant what they said about prison. Why risk it then? His dark eyes studied her face. "You could have turned me in." Clara thought about it as she worked through her morning chores, feeding animals and checking fences. By evening, when she finally felt safe enough to bring Dakota back to the house, she still wasn't entirely sure of her answer. She prepared a simple supper of cornbread and beans, setting to places at her kitchen table. The familiar domestic routine felt strange with him there, but not as unsettling as she'd expected. He ate neatly, despite his bonds, and helped clear dishes afterward by carrying them carefully to her wash basin. My husband would have said it was the right thing to do, she said finally, answering his earlier question. He always believed in hearing both sides of any quarrel. Dakota nodded. A wise man, he was. Clara smiled sadly. 6 years gone now, but I still try to live by his principles. Heavy snow began falling as night descended, blanketing the world in muffled white. Clara added wood to the stove, watching the flakes swirl past her window. She'd need to check on the livestock extra early, make sure their water hadn't frozen. Morning brought clear skies and deep drifts. Clara made her way carefully to town for supplies, leaving Dakota safely hidden in the barn loft. The general store was warm and busy, full of people stocking up after the storm. Clara, the postmistress, Sarah, beckoned her over to the mail counter. Her round face was pinched with concern. Heard tell the railroad foreman himself is riding in by nightfall. Bringing more men too. Clara's stomach clenched. The foreman, Sarah nodded emphatically. Mean as a rattler, that one. Says he'll search every building in the county if he has to. She leaned closer, lowering her voice. They're saying that Apache fellow killed 2 guards escaping. Though my Thomas swears he heard different from his cousin who works the prison kitchen. Clara barely heard the rest of Sarah's gossip. Her mind was already racing ahead, weighing options. She needed help, someone with influence who could be trusted. The answer came clear as a bell: Reverend Hollis. The circuit preacher was respected by all sides, known for his fair handling of disputes between settlers and natives. More importantly, he kept careful records of treaties and land agreements from his years of traveling between settlements. Clara hurried through her shopping, then rode straight to the Reverend's small house near the church. Her mare's hooves kicked up snow as they cantered down the lane. Time was precious now. She had to get back before the foreman's men arrived. The white clapboard building came into view, smoke rising steadily from its chimney. Clara dismounted quickly, her boots crunching in the snow as she hurried to the care door. She had no plan yet, but she knew one thing with certainty. She couldn't let them take Dakota back to that prison. Not without at least trying to prove his innocence. Taking a deep breath, she raised her hand to knock. Whatever came next would change everything, but doing right wasn't always about doing what was safe. Clara urged her mare through the deep snow, her breath forming white clouds in the crisp morning air. The fresh powder made the ride into Silver Bluff slower than usual, but she couldn't risk rushing and having her horse slip. Her thoughts kept drifting back to Dakota, hidden away in her barn loft. The irony wasn't lost on her just days ago. She'd been a quiet widow, minding her own business. Now here she was, harboring a fugitive and riding out to seek legal counsel. The church spire rose above the snow-covered buildings, its weathered cross pointing skyward. Beside it stood Reverend Hollis's modest home, smoke curling from the chimney. Clara tied her horse to the hitching post and brushed snow from her skirts before knocking. The door opened to reveal the Reverend's lean, weathered face. "Mrs. Whitley." "This is unexpected." His eyes crinkled with concern. "Everything all right out at your place? I need your counsel, Reverend. It's rather urgent." Clara glanced over her shoulder, though the street was empty save for fresh snow. He ushered her inside, where a pot of coffee bubbled on the wood stove. "Sit down, Clara. You look troubled." Clara warmed her hands around the cup he offered, then told him everything: the auction, Dakota's story about the railroad dispute, and the men searching for him. As she spoke, the Reverend's expression grew increasingly grave. "This auction," he interrupted, running a hand through his graying hair. "Was there any documentation?" "Papers showing his conviction." Clara shook her head. "Just the auctioneers. Word that he came from the territorial prison." "That's troubling." Reverend Hollis stood and went to a large trunk in the corner. He pulled out a leather portfolio filled with carefully preserved documents. "These are copies of treaties I've collected over the years. Marriage certificates, land deeds, agreements between settlers and tribal leaders." His fingers traced down a page. If Dakota's people had legal grazing rights through any existing treaty, his imprisonment for defending those rights would be unlawful. Hope flickered in Clara's chest. "Then we could appeal to the territorial judge." "We could." The Reverend sat back down, his expression serious. "But Clara, these proceedings take weeks, sometimes months. The court in Denver moves at its own pace. And that's assuming we can gather enough evidence to prove his case." Weeks. Clara's stomach tightened. "The railroad foreman is coming tonight with more men. Then we'd best get started right away." He pulled out fresh paper and an inkwell. "I'll help you draft a petition. But Clara, ... He caught her eye. "You understand the risk you're taking. This won't be popular with certain folks in town." Clara thought of her empty ranch, the years of loneliness since losing Thomas. "Some things are worth the risk, Reverend." They spent the next hour carefully composing the petition, with Reverend Hollis adding references to specific treaties and legal precedents. By the time Clara folded the papers into her coat pocket, the winter sun was already low in the sky. "I'll send a letter to a lawyer I know in Denver," the Reverend said, as she prepared to leave. "He's helped with similar cases before. But be careful, Clara. Watch your back." Clara hurried through town, stopping only to purchase extra feed and lamp oil. The store owner's wife watched her with barely concealed curiosity, no doubt wondering why the widow Whitley needed so many supplies all of a sudden. Dusk was falling by the time she reached her ranch. She found Dakota where she'd left him, reading one of her husband's old books by lantern light in the loft. His bound hands made turning pages awkward, but he'd managed. Over a simple supper of salt pork and potatoes, Clara explained the plan. "If we can prove your imprisonment violated treaty rights, the territorial judge might grant your release. But it will take time, weeks," the Reverend says. Dakota nodded slowly. "You would risk this for me, a stranger." "You're not exactly a stranger anymore." Clara gestured to his empty plate. "Anyone who helps with dishes has earned at least that much consideration." A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "Then I will stay hidden until you return from filing the petition." He paused. "You asked before about the spring, yes?" Clara leaned forward slightly. The thought of water for her drought-stricken land had been tempting her all day. "It lies in a protected valley, fed by mountain snow. even in the driest summers. It flows strong. My people have known of it for generations. His dark eyes met hers. It could save your ranch, Mrs. Whitley, but only if we both survive long enough to reach it. Clara nodded, understanding the weight of what remained unspoken. They would each need to trust the other if either was to succeed. That night, Clara tossed and turned, her mind to full for sleep. The enormity of what she'd undertaken pressed down on her the legal battle ahead. The risk of discovery, the chance of failure. But underneath it all ran a current of certainty. This was right, even if it wasn't easy. Dawn brought clearer skies, and a bitter cold that made the snow crunch underfoot as Clara went to do her morning chores. She was heading to the barn when something made her pause. There, cutting through the pristine snow, were fresh tracks, boot prints that didn't belong to her or Tako. Someone had been watching the barn. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs as she followed the tracks with her eyes. They circled the building before disappearing toward the road. The message was clear. She wasn't as alone as she thought. With trembling hands, she unlatched the barn door, fighting to keep her movements casual in case unseen eyes still watched. Inside, she climbed the ladder just far enough to whisper a warning to Dakota. His only response was a slight nod, but she saw his muscles tense, ready for whatever might come. Back in her kitchen, Clara gripped the edge of her worn table and took deep breaths. The tracks changed everything and nothing. She'd chosen her path. Now she had to be brave enough to walk it. The pale winter sun had barely cleared the eastern hills when Clara began preparing for their journey. She pulled her late husband's old coat from the cedar chest where it had lain untouched for 6 years. The brown wool still held traces of Thomas's pipe tobacco scent. Making her pause for a moment, fingers tracing the worn lapels. His wide-brimmed hat lay beneath, dusty but serviceable. She gathered supplies methodically. Jerky wrapped in waxed paper, hard biscuits, matches in a tin, extra blankets. Each item chosen with care. Nothing that would raise suspicion if someone happened to spot her riding out. The morning light streamed through frost-covered windows as she worked, casting long shadows across the plank floor. When everything was ready, Clara led her mare and Thomas's old gelding to the barn. Dakota emerged from the shadows of the loft, moving with the quiet grace she'd come to expect from him. She held out the coat and hat. "These were my husband's," she said softly. "They should help disguise you, at least from a distance." Dakota accepted them with a respectful nod. The coat's shoulders fit well enough, though the sleeves ran short. On his tall frame, with the hat pulled low and the coat collar turned up, he could pass for any rancher at first glance. They set out single file, Clara leading the way on her mare, while Dakota followed on the gelding. The snow was deep but powder soft, their horses stepping carefully through the drifts. Clara chose the narrowest trails, those hidden between rocky outcrops where the wind had swept the snow into rippling patterns. "This path," she explained over her shoulder, "my husband showed me. Few folks know it exists." About 2 hours into their journey, Clara's saddle began to slip sideways. She dismounted to check the cinch, finding the leather worn thin and stretched. "Allow me," Dakota said, swinging down from his horse. His bound hands made the work awkward, but his fingers moved with practiced skill as he adjusted the straps and retied the cinch with a special knot. "This will hold better." "Much obliged," Clara said, testing the saddle. It sat firm and true. "You know your way around horse tack." "My people have worked with horses since before my grandmother's grandmother was born." A hint of pride colored his voice. "It is in our blood." They continued on, the trail winding higher into the foothills. Pine branches hung heavy with snow, occasionally dropping soft clumps that dissolved into powder before reaching the ground. The afternoon light was starting to fade when Clara finally reined in beside a small clearing. There, she pointed to a sturdy log structure nearly invisible against the tree line. The Line Shack. It was a simple cabin, built years ago for cowboys working the high pastures. Clara dismounted and worked the frozen door latch with mittened hands. Inside, dust motes danced in the weak light filtering through a single window. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a narrow cot in the corner and rough shelves along another wall. "It's not much," Clara said, brushing cobwebs from the window. "But it's warm once the fire's going, and no one comes here in winter." Dakota nodded, taking in the space. "It will serve well." They worked together to make the cabin habitable. Clara swept while Dakota carried in firewood from the stack outside. Soon a small fire crackled in the hearth, pushing back the winter chill. They shared a simple meal of jerky and biscuits, the food tasting better for their long ride. As darkness gathered outside, Dakota spoke quietly. "Before I left my people, my grandmother had a vision." He stared into the flames. She saw a woman with snow in her hair who would help lead me to freedom. I did not understand then. Clara touched her hair self-consciously, where strands of silver had begun threading through the brown. Something stirred in her chest, a feeling she hadn't experienced since Thomas's death. It was like the first warm breeze of spring after a long winter, a whisper of possibility. "I'm not sure I'm the one your grandmother saw," she said honestly. "I'm just trying to do what's right. Sometimes that is enough." Dakota's dark eyes met hers. The right path and the easy path are rarely the same. Clara gathered her things, knowing she needed to leave while enough light remained to follow the trail home. She left him with supplies, food, blankets, matches, and a battered tin cup. "I'll return in 2 days," she promised, pulling her coat tight. "Once I file the petition in town, we'll know better what to do next." Dakota stood in the doorway, Thomas's coat making him look almost like a regular rancher. "Be careful, Mrs. Whitley. You risk much by helping me." "Clara," she said suddenly. "Please, call me Clara." He nodded once, solemnly. "Travel safely, Clara." The snow began falling again as she mounted her mare, fat flakes drifting down in the gathering dusk. Clara turned her horse toward home, the fresh powder already beginning to cover their tracks. Behind her, smoke from the Line Shack's chimney rose straight and true in the still air, then dispersed like a secret among the darkening trees. The winter dusk had settled early as Clara approached her ranch, her mare's hooves crunching through fresh snow. The temperature had dropped sharply during her ride home, and her cheeks stung from the biting wind. As she rounded the corner of the barn, something dark caught her eye near the fence line, a small heap that seemed out of place. Against the white landscape, Clara dismounted quickly, her boots sinking into the powder as she made her way toward the shape. Her heart jumped when she realized it was a child, curled up against the wooden fence posts. A boy, no more than 10 years old, lay unconscious in native clothing now crusted with snow. "Dear Lord," she whispered, kneeling beside him. His skin felt ice cold, but she could see the slight rise and fall of his chest. Without hesitation, she gathered him in her arms, surprised at how light he was, and carried him toward the house. Inside, Clara laid him on the rug before the hearth, quickly building up the fire until flames roared in the grate. She removed his frozen moccasins and outer clothes, wrapping him in warm blankets. His hands worried her most. The fingers were white and stiff with frostbite. As she gently rubbed his hands to restore circulation, the boy's eyes fluttered open. Dark eyes, full of confusion and fear, darted around the room before settling on her face. "You're safe now," Clara said, softly, continuing to warm his hands. "I found you in the snow." The boy tried to sit up, wincing. "Kobe," he stammered through chattering teeth. "My name." "I'm Clara," she responded, pulling another blanket around his shoulders. "Can you tell me what happened, Kobe?" "How did you?" End up at my fence. Kobe's English came haltingly, mixed with words she didn't understand. Trading post, ... 3 suns ago. Family there. Then, ... he made a shooing motion with his hand. Men make us go. Got lost in snow. Clara heated water for tea, adding extra honey to help warm him from within. As Kobe sipped carefully from the cup, she examined his hands more closely. The frostbite wasn't as severe as she'd first feared, but his fingers would need careful. Tending Dot through the night, Clara stayed by his side, keeping the fire well fed and applying warm compresses to his hands. She hummed old hymns her mother had sung to her. Watching as Kobe finally drifted into exhausted sleep, the next morning dawned clear and cold. After ensuring Kobe could eat a small breakfast of cornmeal mush, Clara made a decision. The boy needed more help than she could provide alone, and she knew someone who might be able to communicate with him better. Kobe, she said, laying out her late husband's warmest sweater, which would serve as a coat for the boy. I'm going to take you to meet a friend. Someone who might understand more about your people. The boy nodded solemnly, allowing her to help him into the oversized sweater. Clara hitched up the wagon, making a nest of blankets in the back where Kobe could ride protected from the wind. The journey to the line shack took longer with the wagon, but by mid-morning, smoke from the chimney came into view. Dakota stepped out as they approached, his expression changing from wariness to concern when he saw the small passenger in Clara's wagon. Clara helped Kobe down, supporting him as they walked to the cabin's door. Inside the warmth of the shack, Dakota knelt before the boy, speaking first in Apache. When Kobe shook his head, Dakota switched to another language that made the boys' eyes light up with recognition. They conversed rapidly, Dakota's deep voice gentle as he drew out the boy's story. He is you, Dakota explained to Clara. His band was camping near the trading post when railroad men came with papers they could not read. They were forced to leave their winter grounds. His jaw tightened. The same story, told again and again. Kobe spoke again, gesturing with his still tender hands. Dakota translated, he says they scattered in the storm. He has been walking for 3 days, trying to find his way back to the trading post. Clara's heart ached for the lost child. Tell him he can stay with us until we find his people. I won't see him wandering alone in the snow. When Dakota translated, Kobe's face showed the first real smile Clara had seen from him. The boy reached out and touched Clara's sleeve with bandaged fingers, saying something that made Dakota chuckle. He says you are warm like his grandmother, Dakota translated. He asks if you will tell him stories, as she did. Clara felt tears prick at her eyes. Tell him I would be honored. As the afternoon settled into evening, Clara prepared a hearty stew from the supplies she'd brought, adding extra portions for their unexpected guest. The small cabin filled with a savory scent of cooking. And for the first time since Thomas's death, Clara felt the warmth of sharing a meal with family. Unexpected and unusual as this family might be, they sat together around the fire, Kobe between them, as snow fell steadily outside. The boy had regained some of his strength, watching with interest as Clara stirred the stew and Dakota told stories in his mixture of Apache and Ute. Despite the storm's howl beyond the walls, the line shack felt like a sanctuary, filled with the kind of warmth that had nothing to do with the fire's heat, as they shared the stew from tin bowls. Clara watched Kobe attempt to manage his spoon with wrapped hands, his determination evident in his furrowed brow. Dakota quietly showed him an easier way to hold the utensil. The gesture so natural it made Clara's throat tighten with emotion. The boy's presence had changed something in the atmosphere of the cabin. Where before there had been wariness and uncertainty, now there was purpose. They were no longer just two unlikely allies brought together by circumstance. They were protectors of this child, who had literally fallen into their care. The morning sun broke through thinning clouds as Clara secured the last bundle to her saddle. The storm had finally released its grip on the land, leaving behind a crystalline world of white. She checked her saddlebags one final time, making sure she had enough dried beef and cornbread for several days' journey. "Miss Martha will take good care of him," Reverend Hollis assured her, standing in his doorway. Inside, his wife could be seen showing Kobe how to string wooden beads, the boy's bandaged hands already more nimble than days before. "Much obliged," Clara said, her breath visible in the cold air. "We shouldn't be gone more than 4 or 5 days." Dakota sat astride the spare horse Clara had borrowed from the Reverend, wearing Thomas's old coat and hat. To any passing stranger, he might have passed for a ranch hand, though his bearing spoke of something far different, a dignity that no borrowed clothes could disguise. They rode out of town as the church bell struck 8, taking the westward trail toward the foothills. Clara's mare picked her way carefully through the snow, following Dakota's lead as he guided them onto game trails she'd never noticed before. "The spring lies 3 days' ride," Dakota explained as they climbed higher into the pine-covered slopes. "We must cross the high meadow before the thaw floods the valley below." Clara nodded, understanding the urgency. Her ranch's well had been sinking lower with each passing week, and without a reliable water source, she'd lose everything she and Thomas had built. As the sun climbed higher, Dakota began pointing out signs she would have missed: the fresh scrape of elk antlers on a tree trunk, the delicate prints of a snowshoe hare zigzagging between bushes, the wing marks where an owl had swooped down for prey. "The land speaks," he said, reining in beside a fallen log. "You must learn its language to survive here." Clara dismounted to examine the tracks he indicated. "Show me," she said, and watched as his weathered hands traced the stories written in the snow. They made camp that night in a sheltered grove, the horses ground-tied nearby. As Clara stirred a pot of beans over their small fire, Dakota spoke of his people's connection to these mountains. He told of summers spent gathering medicine plants, of sacred ceremonies performed beneath the stars, of wisdom passed down through generations about living in harmony with the harsh but beautiful land. "My grandfather's grandfather knew these trails," he said, his voice carrying the weight of memory. "Before the iron horse came, before the papers that made borders where none existed." Clara listened, seeing the landscape through new eyes. "The railroad men act like nothing existed here before them," she said quietly. Dakota nodded. "They see only empty spaces to fill. They do not know how to read the old stories in each valley, each spring. The next day brought them higher into the mountains where the air grew thin and sharp in their lungs. They crossed a wind-swept ridge, the horses struggling through drifts up to their chests. Clara's fingers and toes numbed despite her thick gloves and boots. But she pressed on, following Dakota's sure guidance. That evening, they found shelter in a shallow cave. As they huddled near their small fire, Dakota shared more stories. Tales of his grandmother's visions, of battles fought not with weapons, but with wisdom, of peace treaties made and broken. "The spring we seek," he said, feeding another stick to the flames. "It has been sacred to my people for more generations than can be counted. The waters speak to those who listen with respect." Clara wrapped her hands around a tin cup of coffee, absorbing his words. "A promise," she said softly, "to honor its sacred nature." Dawn of the 3rd day painted the snow-covered peaks in shades of rose and gold. They set out early, Dakota leading them through a narrow pass between towering cliffs. The air grew notably warmer as they descended into a hidden valley, sheltered from the harsh mountain winds. Near midday, Dakota raised his hand for them to stop. He dismounted, touching the ground reverently. "We walk from here," he said. "Horses must not approach too closely." Clara followed his lead, her legs stiff from riding. They tied the horses in a grove of stunted pines and continued on foot, climbing over snow-covered boulders. The sound of running water grew stronger with each step, each step. Then, rounding a massive rock face, Clara stopped in wonder. Before them lay a clear pool, steam rising gently from its surface despite the winter air. The water bubbled up from somewhere deep in the earth, creating a perfect circle, perhaps 20 feet across. The surrounding rocks glittered with ice, but the pool itself remained fluid, its surface dancing with tiny ripples. "Oh," Clara breathed, understanding now why this place was sacred. The steam carried a mineral scent, ancient and clean, speaking of depths she could only imagine. Tokoda stood quietly beside her, allowing her to absorb the magnitude of what they'd found. Finally, he spoke. "The water never freezes. Even in the coldest winters, it flows. My people say it carries the earth's own heartbeat." Clara knelt at the pool's edge, feeling the warmth rising from the water. This could save her ranch, she realized. More than that, it could provide life-giving water for all who lived in the valley below, settler and native alike. "If we could channel this ... double quotes," she began. "It must be done with respect," Tokoda said firmly. "Not like the railroad men with their dynamite and iron pipes. The old ways know how to guide water without breaking its spirit." Clara nodded, still mesmerized by the steaming pool. "Will you teach me these ways?" she asked. "That is why I brought you here," Tokoda replied, "to show that there is another path than force. Water, like truth, finds its own way when we listen." They spent the afternoon studying the spring's flow, Tokoda showing Clara how the water naturally sought certain channels in the rock. He explained how his people had used small stone guides over generations, working with the water's own desire to flow rather than forcing it as the sun began to sink behind the peaks, casting long shadows. Across the snow, Clara felt a profound sense of hope she hadn't known in years. This spring represented more than just water for her ranch. It was a chance to prove that different peoples could share the land's gifts, if only they approached with respect and understanding. Clara and Tokoda worked quickly in the fading light, gathering stones to mark the sacred spring's location. They placed them in a pattern Tokoda said his people would recognize 3 small cairns forming a triangle that pointed to the water's source. "We'll need more than stones to convince a territorial judge," Clara said, sketching the springs location in her small notebook. She added landmarks and distances, just as Thomas had taught her to do with property lines. "The water itself will speak truth," Tokoda replied, securing the last stone. "But first we must protect what remains." They mounted their horses as the last rays of sunlight painted the snow in deep purple shadows. Clara estimated they could make it back to the ranch by midnight if they pushed hard. But as they crested the first ridge heading east, Tokoda suddenly reined his horse to a stop. "Smoke," he said, pointing to a dark smudge against the dimming sky. Too much for a cooking fire. Clara felt her heart skip. The smoke rose from the direction of her ranch. Without a word, they spurred their horses forward, taking the downhill trail as fast as they dared in the gathering darkness. The horses' hoofs kicked up snow as they descended, their breath coming in great steaming clouds. The closer they got to the ranch, the more Clara's dread grew. The smoke now billowed thick and black against the stars, and she could see an orange glow lighting up the night sky. She urged her mare faster, praying she was wrong about what waited ahead. They thundered into the ranch yard to find chaos. Her barn was engulfed in flames, the old wood crackling and popping in the intense heat. Neighbors from nearby homesteads formed a bucket line from the well to the fire, but Clara could see it was too late. The roof was already caving in, sending sparks shooting skyward. "The horses," she called out, sliding from her saddle. "Got 'em out," shouted old Pete, her nearest neighbor. "Soon as we saw the smoke, we came running. Managed to save most of what was inside, too." Clara staggered with relief, watching as the bucket line continued its futile work. The heat of the fire pushed everyone back, and she could only stand and watch as the barn, the one Thomas had built with his own hands, collapsed in on itself with a tremendous crash. Clara, Reverend Hollis appeared at her elbow, his face streaked with soot. "Thank the Lord you're back. Kobe's safe. Martha's got him at our place, still." The railroad men, Dakota said quietly beside her. It wasn't a question. The Reverend nodded grimly. 3 riders seen heading this way earlier today. Didn't stop in town, just rode straight through. By the time anyone noticed the fire, T spread his hands helplessly. Clara wrapped her arms around herself, shivering despite the fire's heat. "A warning," she said, her voice hard. "They want us to know they can reach us anywhere." The bucket line gradually disbanded as the fire burned down to glowing embers. Neighbors came to offer help with rebuilding, but Clara barely heard them. Her mind was racing ahead, calculating what this meant for their safety. "We can't stay here," Dakota said, reading her thoughts. "They will return, and next time it may not be just the barn." Clara nodded slowly. "We need to get Kobe and head for the line shack tonight. It's too dangerous to wait until morning." "I'll have Martha pack some food," Reverend Hollis offered, "and I'll send word when it's safe to return." While the Reverend rode back to town, Clara and Dakota salvaged what they could from the barn's ruins. The heavy smell of smoke hung in the air as they worked, reminding Clara with every breath of what they faced. The railroad men had made their position clear. They would stop at nothing to maintain their power over the territory. An hour later, they were loading supplies onto their horses when Reverend Hollis returned with Kobe. The boy's eyes went wide at the sight of the destroyed barn. But he said nothing as Clara helped him mount behind Dakota. "Take care," the Reverend said quietly, pressing a package of food into Clara's hands. "I'll start gathering those treaty documents we discussed. And Clara." He caught her arm as she turned to mount. "You're doing the right thing. I'll let them make you doubt that." Clara squeezed his hand in thanks, then swung into her saddle. The 3 of them rode out under cover of darkness, taking a roundabout trail to throw off any watchers. The night was clear and cold, stars glittering like ice. Above them, behind them, the last flames flickered out in the ruins of the barn. But Clara didn't look back. Her path lay ahead now, no matter how difficult it might become. They rode in silence through the night, Kobe dozing against Dakota's back while Clara led the way toward the line shack. The familiar landscape looked different in darkness, but she'd traveled this route enough times to find it by instinct. As they climbed higher into the foothills, the air grew sharper with cold and the snow deeper under their horses. Hooves. Dawn was just beginning to light the eastern sky when they finally reached the line shack. Clara did a careful sweep of the area before allowing them to dismount, but found no sign anyone had been there since their last visit. Inside, Tokade got a fire going while Clara helped Kobe settle onto a pile of blankets. "Sleep now," she told the exhausted boy. "You're safe here." As Kobe drifted off, Clara and Dakota sat by the fire, speaking in low voices about what came next. The barn burning had changed everything. There could be no going back until they had proof to take to the territorial judge. Their only hope lay in the sacred spring and the treaties that protected native water rights. But first, they had to survive long enough to make their case. Outside, the sun rose over the mountains, painting the snow in shades of pink and gold. Clara watched through the shack's single window, her heart heavy with the weight of what lay ahead. But when she looked at Kobe sleeping peacefully nearby, and Dakota keeping steady watch by the fire, she felt her resolve strengthen. Some things were worth fighting for, no matter the cost. Moonlight filtered through pine boughs as Clara led their small group back to the line shack. She kept her mare to a careful walk, mindful of the fresh snow that could hide treacherous ground behind. Her Dakota rode with Kobe, both of them silent shadows in the darkness. The shack appeared as a low, take shape against the trees. Clara circled the clearing twice, checking for signs of visitors before allowing them to approach. Inside, she lit a single lantern, keeping the flame low enough that only a faint glow would show through the single window. "Home again," she whispered to Kobe, helping him down from Dakota's horse. The boy's hands were still tender from frostbite, but his smile showed his relief at returning to their refuge. They settled into a quiet routine over the next days. Clara mended tack in the mornings, her needle flashing in the wan winter light, while Kobe practiced his English letters in the dirt floor. Dakota repaired their boots and taught the boy to weave snowshoes from strips of rawhide, speaking softly in a mixture of Apache and Ute that seemed to comfort the child. During the long afternoons, Dakota shared his knowledge of the railroad's expansion. His deep voice remained steady as he named the men who had driven his people from their hunting grounds. Powerful men who now sat on territorial courts and banking boards. "Marshal Kane oversees the prison contracts," he explained, watching as Clara recorded each detail in Thomas's old leather ledger. He and Judge Morrison share ownership in the railroad's land company. They ensure any Apache or Ute who protests disappears into a work gang. Clara's hand tightened on her pencil. "The same Judge Morrison who'll hear our treaty claim." Dakota nodded grimly. "The very same. The railroad men call him their insurance policy against tribal complaints." She wrote it all down: dates, places, names of witnesses who might still be found. The ledger pages filled with evidence of corruption that reached from the prison yards to the courthouse steps. Her hand ached from writing, but she pressed on, knowing each detail might matter. Kobe helped by keeping the fire fed and the coffee hot. He moved more surely now, his initial wariness replaced by a quiet confidence in their strange family unit. Sometimes he would hum soft songs in Ute while he worked, the melody carrying hints of his people's stories. On the third morning, Clara woke to the sound of approaching hoofbeats. She reached for her rifle before recognizing the distinctive gait of Sam Weber's old mare. The storekeeper had been Thomas's friend, one of the few townspeople who still treated her fairly after she'd bought Dakota at auction. She met him outside while Dakota and Kobe stayed hidden in the shack. Sam's round face was creased with worry as he dismounted. "Didn't know if I'd find you here," he said, stamping his feet against the cold. "But I had to try." "There's trouble brewing in town, Clara." Her stomach tightened. "What kind of trouble?" "The railroad foreman's got the sheriff forming a posse. 20 men or more, all armed. They're claiming legal authority to retrieve their prisoner, meaning your Apache friend in there." He gestured toward the shack. "They're planning to ride out at first light tomorrow." Clara felt the blood drain from her face. 20 armed men. "Sam, that's not a posse, that's a hunting party. Exactly why I rode out to warn you." He gripped her arm. "You've got maybe 24 hours before they start searching these hills." And Clara, his voice dropped lower, "I heard them talking in the saloon. They don't plan to take him alive this time." She nodded, her mind already racing ahead. "Thank you, Sam. You're a good friend to risk warning us. Your Thomas would have done the same for me." He mounted up, then hesitated. "Whatever you're planning, be careful. These railroad men, they don't play by any rules but their own." Clara watched until he disappeared among the trees, then hurried back inside. Dakota and Kobe looked up as she entered, reading the news in her expression. "They come," Dakota said simply. It wasn't a question. "Tomorrow at dawn, 20 armed men." Clara sank onto a rough-hewn bench. "Sam says they don't intend to take prisoners this time." Kobe pressed closer to Toka's side, his dark eyes wide with fear. The Apache man rested a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder. "Then we must choose our ground before they choose it for us," he said. Hiding is no longer enough. Clara pulled out Thomas's ledger, running her fingers over the damning evidence they'd gathered. No, it's not. But we have something they don't. Expect proof of their crimes against your people. If we can get this to the territorial capital, they will block any legal path, Dakota reminded her. Judge Morrison ensures that. Then we go above him. The governor has a reputation for fairness, and he's no friend to the railroad. But we'd need time to reach him. She studied the crude map they'd drawn of the Sacred Springs location. Time we don't have with a posse on our trail. They spent the afternoon in careful planning, speaking in low voices, while Kobe kept watch at the window. Clara knew they could no longer simply react to the railroad's moves. They needed to force the confrontation on their own terms. As evening approached, she checked their ammunition and supplies, her father's words echoing in her mind. Sometimes, standing your ground means choosing the right hill to stand on. Looking at Dakota teaching Kobe to pack his bedroll for quick travel, she knew she'd found a cause worth any hill. The sun set behind the mountains, painting the snow in shades of purple and gold. Inside the lined shack, they kept the lantern unlit, preparing in darkness for whatever the dawn might bring. Clara added one final entry to Thomas's ledger, a letter explaining everything they'd discovered. In case things went wrong tomorrow, we should sleep, Dakota said quietly. Tomorrow will come soon enough. Clara nodded, helping Kobe settle into his blankets. The boy caught her hand before she could move away. Stay safe, he whispered in careful English. All stay safe. Will. Try, little one, she promised, smoothing his dark hair. We'll try. Clara woke, while stars still glittered in the ink-black sky. She moved quietly through the shack, gathering their prepared supplies by touch. Dakota was already awake, his shape a darker shadow against the wall. Together, they gently roused Kobe, who blinked sleepily but remembered their practiced plan. No words, no light, no sound. The horses stomped softly in the pre-dawn chill as Clara secured their packs. She'd chosen their 3 steadiest mounts, knowing speed would matter less than endurance on the journey to Three Pines. Thomas's old maps had shown them the back trails, ways to avoid the main roads where the posse would surely watch. Ready? She whispered, helping Kobe mount behind Dakota. The boy nodded, clutching tight to the Apache's waist. They set out just as the eastern sky began to pale. Clara led them through a narrow deer track she'd discovered years ago, one that wound through dense pine stands where larger groups couldn't follow. The horses picked their way carefully over frozen ground, their breath steaming in the frigid air. By mid-morning, they'd covered nearly 10 miles, staying high on the ridgelines where they could watch for pursuit. Clara kept Thomas's ledger close in her saddlebag, wrapped in oilcloth to protect the precious evidence. Every few miles, Dakota would pause, listening intently before signaling them forward. No hoofbeats, he said, during one such stop. But we must keep moving. The posse will have found the shack by now. They ate dried beef and hard biscuits while riding, stopping only to rest the horses and let Kobe stretch his legs. The boy remained remarkably quiet, understanding the gravity of their flight. His small face was set with determination as he helped gather kindling when they finally made camp at dusk. Clara chose their resting place carefully, a hollow beside a frozen creek, screened by thick brush. The water's ice would carry no tracks, and the dense vegetation would hide their small fire's glow. Still, they kept the flames low, just enough to warm their simple meal of cornbread and the last of Clara's preserved peaches as they ate. Kobe pressed close to Dakota's side, seeking comfort in the growing darkness. The Apache man seemed to sense the boy's need for reassurance. "Let me tell you a story," Dakota said softly, his deep voice barely carrying beyond their small circle. "One my grandmother told me when I was young, like you." Clara watched as Kobe's eyes brightened with interest. The firelight caught the sharp, Plains of Dakota's face as he began to speak. Long ago, a young eagle fell from his nest in a great storm. He was found by a family of prairie wolves who took him in and raised him as their own. The other animals laughed, saying wolves and eagles could never be true family. Dakota paused, looking meaningfully at Kobe. But the wolves taught the eagle to be brave and clever, while the eagle taught the wolves to see far and dream high. Together, they became stronger than either could be alone because they chose each other. Kobe asked in careful English. Dakota nodded. Yes, the strongest. Families are often those we choose, bound by love and trust rather than blood. Like us, here. He gestured to include Clara. Different paths have brought us together, but we protect each other now. That makes us family. Clara felt warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the fire. She saw tears glisten in Kobe's eyes before he quickly wiped them away, sitting straighter with newfound pride. They slept in shifts that night, Clara taking first watch while Dakota and Kobe rested. The creek ice crackled occasionally in the darkness, making her start until she recognized the sound. Above, the stars wheeled slowly across the sky, marking time until their next push toward Three Pines. Dawn brought heavy clouds and the threat of snow. They broke camp quickly, leaving no trace of their presence. Clara estimated they'd make the courthouse by afternoon if they pushed hard, assuming no complications. But complications found them just past noon. They were crossing a high meadow when Dakota raised his hand sharply. Clara heard it a moment later, the rhythmic thud of multiple horses approaching. There was no time to hide. 6 Army cavalrymen in blue wool coats emerged from the tree line, led by a gruff-looking sergeant with gray threading his mustache. The patrol reined in hard at the sight of them, several hands moving to carbine stocks. Well now, the sergeant said slowly, his eyes fixing on Dakota. Don't I know you from Fort Laramie? The Apache translator who disappeared after that railroad dispute. Clara urged her horse forward before Dakota could respond. Sergeant, I'm Clara Whitley. We're riding for the territorial courthouse in Three Pines with evidence of corruption. Evidence that could prevent more bloodshed between settlers and tribes. The sergeant's weathered face remained stern. Ma'am, that man is wanted for questioning about a prison break. I've got orders to detain any Apache matching his description. Then you should also know the prison contract system is illegal under the latest treaties. Clara pressed, her voice firm but respectful. We have proof of judges taking railroad bribes, of Native men being imprisoned without cause. There's a posse forming to stop us. Lives depend on us reaching the courthouse first. The sergeant studied them for a long moment. His eyes lingered on Kobe, huddled against Dakota's back, then moved to the determined set of Clara's jaw. Finally, he sighed. My orders say to detain any suspicious Apache, he said slowly. But they don't say anything about a white widow and a Ute boy traveling to file court papers. He straightened in his saddle. You've got until sundown to reach Three Pines. After that, I'll have to report any Apache I encounter to the fort. Understood, Sergeant? Thank you. Clara fought to keep her voice steady with relief. Move along then, he ordered, gesturing. His men two-part ranks. And ma'am, whatever you're carrying in that saddlebag, make it count. They rode on at a faster pace, the patrol watching until they disappeared around a bend. Clara's heart was still pounding from the encounter, but she felt a surge of hope. If even an army sergeant could see the justice in their cause, perhaps others would too. Time grows short, Dakota said, as they urged their horses to a canter. But we are close now. Clara nodded, squinting at the horizon where dark clouds gathered. Three Pines lay just beyond those clouds, and with it, their chance to challenge the railroad's power with truth. They rode on, three unlikely family members, bound by choice and trust, racing the setting sun toward justice. The sun hung low over 3 Pines when Clara, Dakota, and Kobe finally rode down its dusty main street. Their horses moved with weary steps, heads drooping after the hard journey. Clara's bones ached from hours in the saddle, but relief flooded through her at the sight of the courthouse's whitewashed walls. "We made it," she breathed, glancing at her companions. Dakota nodded silently, while Kobe had dozed off against his back, stirring only when they halted. The town was quiet in the gathering dusk, with only a few lamps burning in shop windows. The church bell tolled 6 times, its clear notes echoing off the surrounding hills. Clara led them to the small wooden church first, its steeple reaching toward the darkening sky. "Kobe needs rest," she said softly. "And it's safer if he's not. Seen with us at the courthouse." The church door creaked open at her knock, revealing the kind face of Pastor Matthew's wife, Sarah. The woman's eyes widened at their trail-worn appearance, but she quickly ushered them inside. "Of course the boy can stay," Sarah whispered, wrapping a blanket around Kobe's shoulders. "There's soup warming on the stove." Clara knelt before Kobe, smoothing his dark hair. "Stay with Mrs. Matthews, little one. We'll return soon." The boy's tired eyes darted between Clara and Dakota before he nodded bravely. Clara's heart squeezed, knowing how much trust he placed in them. Outside, shadows lengthened across the street as Clara and Dakota approached the courthouse. Their boots echoed on the wooden steps, hope rising with each footfall. But when Clara tried the heavy door, it remained firmly locked. A passing clerk, hurrying home with his ledgers, paused at her frustrated sigh, looking for Judge Harrison. "He's away until morning, rode to Denver last week for his daughter's wedding." Clara's shoulders slumped. After their desperate race to reach 3 Pines, another delay felt like a physical blow. She turned to Dakota, expecting to see her own. Disappointment mirrored in his face. Instead, his expression remained calm. "The night is not our enemy," he said quietly. "We reached the town before the posse. That was our first task." Clara drew strength from his steadiness. "You're right. We'll sleep at the church and face what comes at dawn." They returned to find Sarah had prepared space in the church loft, laying clean quilts over fresh straw. The simple space smelled of wood and candle wax, offering sanctuary after their long journey. Through the small window, Clara could see stars beginning to pierce the evening sky. Kobe was already asleep below, curled beside the banked stove. His soft breathing carried up to the loft, reminding Clara of all they fought to protect. She settled onto her quilt, Thomas's ledger still secure in her saddlebag beside her. The events of the past days pressed heavily on her heart. The barn burning, their flight through the wilderness, the Army patrol's mercy. Clara found herself speaking into the darkness, her whispered prayer carrying in the quiet loft. "Lord, I ain't asked for much since Thomas passed," she began, her voice rough with emotion. "But I'm asking now. Give me the strength to face what's coming. Help me protect those who've become my family, strange as that might seem." She paused, gathering her thoughts, and Lord, ... help me remember Thomas's belief that justice matters more than fear. Dakota remained silent throughout her prayer, but Clara felt his watchful presence across the loft. His stillness offered its own kind of comfort as she finally drifted into exhausted sleep. Dawn arrived with heavy footsteps in the street below. Clara woke instantly, moving to the window. Her breath caught at the sight of riders entering town. The posse had arrived. She counted at least 15 men, their horses' hooves kicking up dust in the pale morning light. They spread out with practiced efficiency, taking up positions around the courthouse steps. Among them, she recognized the railroad foreman's broad-brimmed hat. "They mean to stop us from even reaching the judge," she murmured. A wagon's rattle drew her attention to the other end of the street. Her heart lifted. At the sight of Reverend Hollis driving toward the church, his old mare plodding steadily between the buildings. "Wait here," she told Dakota, who nodded understanding. He would remain hidden until the crucial moment. Clara descended the loft ladder and slipped out the church's side door. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of wood smoke from breakfast. Fires. Reverend Hollis had already climbed down from his wagon, his lean frame moving stiffly after the long drive. "Clara," he greeted her warmly, pressing her hands in his weathered ones. "I drove through the night when I heard the posse was gathering." "You're a sight for sore eyes, Reverend," she said with genuine relief. He reached into his wagon and withdrew a leather-wrapped bundle. "I brought what you asked for. Thomas's papers from my records, including something that might interest the judge particularly." Clara unwrapped the bundle with trembling fingers. There, amongst deed copies and letters, lay a carefully preserved map. Its careful ink lines showed treaty boundaries, with Thomas's neat notations in the margins about water rights and grazing lands. Thomas believed in keeping records clear, Reverend Hollis said softly. He knew someday they might matter in ways we couldn't foresee. Tears pricked Clara's eyes as she traced her late husband's handwriting. Even now, years after his passing, Thomas was helping her fight for what was right. The courthouse bell began to toll 8 o'clock. Through the morning haze, Clara saw a figure in a black coat mounting the courthouse steps. Judge Harrison had returned. "It's time," she said, squaring her shoulders. The sun broke fully over the hills as Clara clutched the precious bundle of papers. With Reverend Hollis beside her, she began walking toward the courthouse where 15 armed men waited to stop her. But Thomas's map felt like armor against her heart, and she knew she didn't walk alone. The courthouse fell silent as Clara stepped forward. Thomas's leather portfolio clutched tight in her hands. Morning light streamed through tall windows, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. Judge Harrison peered down from his bench, his silver spectacles catching the sun. "Your Honor," Clara began, her voice steadier than she felt, "I have evidence that Dakota was wrongfully imprisoned and that the railroad's claims to the sacred spring violate existing treaties." She carefully unfolded Thomas's map on the judge's desk, pointing to the clear ink lines marking tribal boundaries. The paper crackled softly in the hushed room. "This official treaty map, certified by the territorial governor, shows the spring lies within protected Apache lands." Her finger traced the careful notations in Thomas's hand. "My late husband served as a witness when these boundaries were established." The railroad foreman stepped forward, his boots heavy on the floorboards. "Your Honor, this man is an escaped convict, property of the railroad, legally purchased at auction. The spring's location is irrelevant. I was taken without cause." Dakota spoke from where he stood, dignity in every word. "Our people have held sacred rights to that spring for generations. The railroad men came with guns, claiming water that was never theirs to take." Judge Harrison adjusted his spectacles, studying the map with careful attention. "Reverend Hollis, you have testimony to offer." The Reverend stepped forward, his Bible tucked under one arm. "Yes, Your Honor. I witnessed the original seizure of Dakota and others. No warrants were presented, no charges filed. They were simply rounded up when they protested the railroad's expansion onto treaty lands." Clara held her breath as the judge traced the map's boundaries with one weathered finger. The room remained still, dust motes dancing in the shaft of sunlight between bench and floor. Finally, Judge Harrison looked up. "The treaty boundaries are clear, as are the water rights established therein." He set down his glasses. "I find no legal basis for Dakota's imprisonment or the railroad's claim to the spring. I hereby order his immediate release and bar any further attempts by the railroad to access or develop the protected water source." The foreman's face darkened with fury. "This ain't over," he growled, spinning on his heel and stalking from the courthouse. The door slammed behind him, echoing through the suddenly quiet room. Clara felt relief flood through her body, weakening her knees. Beside her, Tokoda stood straight and tall, a small smile touching his lips. "Thank you, Your Honor," she managed to say. The judge nodded, gathering the papers before him. "Justice may move slowly, Mrs. Whitley, but it does move. See the clerk?" For the official release papers. As they walked down the courthouse steps into the bright morning, Clara knew the railroad foreman's words held truth. This fight wasn't over. But for now, Tokoda was free, and the sacred spring would remain protected. She watched as Reverend Hollis shook Tokoda's hand, the two men sharing a look of quiet understanding. The first hints of spring whispered through Silver Bluff as patches of earth emerged from melting snow. Clara stood on her porch, watching a wagon loaded with fresh-cut timber roll up the rutted path to her ranch. Tom Baker and his sons had brought the first load, and more neighbors followed, their horses' hooves squelching in the half-frozen mud. "Ain't right what happened to your barn?" Tom called out, already rolling up his sleeves. "Reckon we can get the frame up before the next storm." Clara's throat tightened at their kindness. Just weeks ago, these same neighbors had kept their distance. Now they came bearing lumber and willing hands, understanding at last that justice knew no color. Inside the ranch house, Kobe sat cross-legged by the blazing hearth, carefully flexing his healing fingers. The frostbite had left him with tender skin, but Dr. Wilson said he would keep full use of his hands. The boy looked up as Clara entered, offering a shy smile. "Better today?" she asked, touching his shoulder gently. He nodded, holding up his hands. "Much better. Can help build now." "Soon," she promised, hearing the eager note in his voice. Through the window, she watched Tokoda working with the men, his quiet competence earning their respect. He showed them how to notch the support beams in a way his people had used for generations, creating joints that would hold fast against prairie winds. The days fell into a rhythm. Morning brought the sound of hammers and saws. Afternoons filled with the steady work of mending what the harsh winter had broken. Toko rode the fence lines with Clara, teaching her to splice wire with swift, sure movements of his hands. Their shoulders brushed as they worked, comfortable in shared silence. When the evening sun painted the sky in shades of amber, Clara and Tokoda rode together to the sacred spring. The water bubbled up clear and sweet, catching the last light like scattered gold. They dismounted, letting their horses graze while they sat on sun-warmed rocks beside the pool. "I never thought I would see this place again," Tokoda said softly. Watching the water's surface mirror the deepening sky, Clara turned to look at him, seeing the peace in his expression. "Thank you for trusting me with it," she said. "With everything?" Met her gaze steadily. "You were not afraid to stand up when others turned away. My grandmother's prophecy was true. The woman with snow in her hair did bring freedom." Clara touched her graying temples self-consciously, then smiled. Sometimes courage just means doing what your heart knows is right. They sat together as the first stars appeared, the spring's gentle music filling the comfortable silence between them. Below, in the valley, lamplight glowed from her ranch house windows, where Kobe would be setting out supper plates, waiting for their return. The air held the softness of coming spring, promise threading through the evening breeze. Clara breathed deeply, feeling the rightness of this moment, her land healing, her heart at peace, and beside her, a friend who had helped her find her own kind of courage. Spring painted the Colorado Territory in fresh colors, turning brown hills to emerald and filling creek beds with snowmelt. Clara's ranch flourished, the sacred spring's water now flowing steadily to her well through carefully laid pipes. The garden burst with early vegetables, and new calves dotted the pastures. Kobe thrived too. walking to school each morning with his books tucked under his arm. His quick mind soaked up reading and numbers, while his healing hands grew strong again, working the ranch chores. The townsfolk, who once whispered now, greeted him with warm smiles. Dakota built a small cabin just over the ridge, close enough to help both Clara's ranch and his Apache kin. It became a bridge between worlds, teaching ranchers the old ways of water sharing while helping his people navigate new boundaries. His quiet wisdom earned respect from both sides. On this particular evening, Clea stirred a pot of rabbit stew, the kitchen warm and fragrant. Lamplight cast dancing shadows as Kobe set out tin plates, chattering about his day at school. Dakota arrived with fresh bread from town, his eyes crinkling with pleasure at the familiar scene. Over supper, their laughter mixed with cricket song drifting through the open window. Clara watched them, her heart full. $2 bought me a man the world feared, she thought, but God gave me a family the world cannot take away. The firelight touched their faces with golden warmth, while far above, spring waters trickled down from snow-capped hills, eternal and free. Thank you for watching. If this one reached you, consider subscribing. I'll be back tomorrow with more meaning, more humanity.